Okie doke. So, happiness and consumption. So, just getting my technique sorted out. Here's our list of problems. Here's happiness or a proxy consumption. Here's our conceptual framework. Are we getting less happy? So, we know on the average, certainly in countries like Sweden, we've got these processes of research and development, replacement of capital, and so on, which leads to more and more production, more and more consumption. Is that actually making us happier? Well, when we look at the data, and you did this with Pedro in module 3, it seems to be, right? We do seem to be getting happier, despite the claims of people like Easterling. Another sort of popular claim is, oh, but the modern society, it's like destroyed communities and so on. It was everything was better in the past. Another sort of things were better in the past idea. Well, that's also hard to find support for in the data. One measure that you might think is relevant is trust between people. And we see in the rich countries where these systems are working well, there's a lot of trust between people. Of course, you could ask yourself, which came first? It could still be the case that the trust gives you the high productivity, and then the high productivity in the long run might destroy that trust. But it doesn't seem very likely. Because if that was true, you would expect it to already be showing up in the data, right? Because what we see is the richest countries, and especially like the Scandinavian countries and Northern European countries, the productivity is at the top of the scale or near the top of the global scale, and the trust is also near the top of the global scale. And it's the least suggestive of the fact that these market economies actually build trust between people. And this would make a lot of sense that the causality goes both ways, right? Because the market economies depend on trust between people to work. And at the same time, when you see that they're working, well, that gives you trust. That it's a sort of mutually, you could argue anyway, that it would be a mutually reinforcing sort of feedback loop. We need the trust to build market economies. When we see market economies working, we trust people even more, and so on. Okay. So, the idea that these modern consumption-based or rich societies with a lot of consumption, is that somehow a sort of a bad thing fundamentally? Is it making us unhappy? Is it destroying communities? I don't think so. I don't buy that story. Okay. It's a very romantic story. I used to believe it. These days, I don't buy it. Maybe it's because I've got older and wiser. Maybe it's because I've got older and something else. Okay. So, moving on from that question of consumption and happiness, and just thinking more about sustainability of increases in consumption. If we want to maintain increases in consumption, and remember this, we're not talking about the mass of goods, we're talking about our willingness to pay for the basket of goods that we can get. They could be lower mass, they could be lower resource use. If we want to maintain that increase, despite environmental limits, what do we need to do? Okay. You might want to pause the video here if you like and have a think about it. You need to break the question up into bits, really, ideally. Okay. But now I'm going to give you some thoughts. Which of the 3 environmental problems do we need to worry about the least? in the long term. So what are the three environmental problems? It's resource exhaustion, pollution, and loss of biodiversity and nature, right? And clearly from the course, my claim in the course is the least problematic one is resource exhaustion. Basically, the market mechanisms are there to deal with that. Sure, resources are run down, but we have substitutes. We have market mechanisms to deal with that process of substitution. Okay, it's not a big deal. So that leaves the other two, pollution and biodiversity loss. What can we do in the long run to reduce pollution flows? Well, pollution flows, according to our conceptual framework here, they're coming from this resource-intensive sector mainly, okay? For instance, carbon dioxide is coming to a huge extent from the burning of fossil fuels. So what do we need to do? We need to stop burning fossil fuels. And what's the best way to do that without cutting, while maintaining the flows of the stuff that we want in this direction in the long run? We got to invest in this sector, right? So in the short run, there's not so much we can do in the very short run. In the medium run, we need to build fewer of this stuff, fewer of these things, and more of things like this, right? And at the same time, we can send more workers. So we send more capital into sectors like this, and more workers into research on improving sectors like this. Okay. So that's the key to reducing pollution flows for most, or the vast majority of pollutants, I would say. Because here the picture is very specific for fossil fuels, but you could have a very closely related story for most other pollutants. We want to target these intermediate good sectors where the pollutants are originating and change the technology in those sectors. Okay, so you could have CFCs and fridges instead, and this is where we're manufacturing CFCs to be used in fridges, but then we need, well, 30, 40 years ago we said no, we can't use CFCs anymore, we need to use something else which works almost as well. Okay, the fridges are basically just as good as they were before, but the stuff we put into the cooling system is not CFCs, and it's hopefully harmless, okay, or much less harmful anyway. Okay, what about biodiversity and nature? So that's pollution flows. What about biodiversity and nature? Well, if we look at this sector, of course these investments in different technologies may well help, but there's also here for that sector, for that area, biodiversity and nature, we have to think about agriculture specifically. And I think personally the consumption patterns there are incredibly relevant, more relevant than in other sectors. It's like, as long as we want to carry on consuming animal products that come from animals, grazing cattle and not some test tube production, sort of test tube meat or whatever, as long as consumers insist on eating animal products as they are, like beef or whatever, and as long as we've got 8 billion people on the planet, and the richer, as people get richer, they want more of this kind of stuff, well, that is going to take more and more of the space that is needed by other species if they're going to survive. Okay, so the way technology is looking at the moment, the way technological options are looking, we have to look at the consumption patterns, especially when you consider that the trend typically globally has been, with increasing income, meat consumption goes up, and we want incomes to go up in big parts of the world where people are still on low incomes. We need to break that link. Okay, so there it's quite a different story compared to pollution. Of course, changes in consumption patterns, if we like fly less and so on, that can help pollution as well. So it's not either or. But for pollution, this box is hugely important. Whereas for biodiversity, this, relatively speaking anyway, what happens in this box is a lot more important. Okay. So, going back, remember we're talking about happiness and consumption, and I've said, look, more consumption is making us happier, or it seems to be, because happiness is going up in countries like Sweden as consumption goes up, for instance, and it's not going up in countries where consumption doesn't go up. And it's higher in countries like Sweden than it is in those low-income countries in general. And at the same time, there's this menu of solutions to deal with, for instance, increasing pollution flows and boosting biodiversity. We can go in, we can deal with carbon emissions, we can deal with CFC emissions. Each particular case, show me the pollutant, I can show you what we need to do to deal with it. Okay. So it's like, okay, everything's fine. Or is it? Okay. Is that the end of the story? Of course it's not. And a guy called Tim Jackson puts this rather nicely. I actually happen to have his book next to me. Quite a nice book. There's a reference to it later. But he made a TED talk referred to here, where he said, we are persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need to create impressions that won't last on people we don't care about. Okay, so what about that? So if that's totally true and the whole story, then we shouldn't see this happiness relationship like yes, right? Because the kind of idea here is this whole consumption race, we're just sort of trying to impress other people, but that's like we're playing some kind of zero-sum status game. We're not going to get happier over time. That's the sort of classic explanation of the Easterlin claims, that as we all get richer, we don't get happier because we're stuck. We're actually in a status game, and our status doesn't go up because we all get richer together. And in fact, if inequality increases at the same time, the majority of people might get less happy. But the data doesn't really support that. We talked about that. But still, this idea is quite attractive, isn't it? So how would that play out? Can we do an economic analysis of this and put this into an economic context? If we think, okay, this idea, it's still this interesting, we want to investigate it within this framework. Okay, so in the next video, I just realized I'm almost up to 15 minutes. In the next video, we're going to do that.